Hey everyone, good morning. And here we are going through about 10 minutes of stuff that we didn't get to on Sunday. This is discussed in home church this week here at Pilgrim. We have been going through Bruxy Cavy's End of Religion and a larger series about peace with God and using that sort of as the backbone. And we are going right now in the middle of his book, and he's talking about how Jesus undoes religion. John chapter 4 is sort of the backstory where Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman, and Samaria was the land between Galilee and Judea, and the Orthodox main Jewish people would often avoid Samaria, go around it. Jesus goes through it, has an encounter with this woman, and an encounter of revealing who he was as more than just a wandering rabbi, but as God. And she becomes a convert by the end of that story and begins evangelizing her whole village. And so this is a wonderful passage of the expansion of Jesus' teaching beyond the narrow confines of ethnic Israel as understood. He confronts 5 T's within Judaism that have become, instead of places of encounter with God, have been turned into religious barriers for most people. And that's the Torah, the tradition of the elders, the tribalism, the territory, and the temple. And these 5 T's within his context, he changes or reinterprets or undoes what had been practiced, or at least was teaching the undoing of that, which of course is a shorthand way of saying, I am God. I am telling you this is what this was supposed to do, this is where it's failing, and this is the new approach to God. We've talked about the rule of love replacing the law, that the law was aiming at the right relationship with God and neighbor. This Sunday we talked more about the tradition of the elders, the fence around the Torah, being more conservative than God, and how that actually doesn't get you any closer to God. In fact, it pushes you farther away, just as sort of false libertinism does the same thing as well, forgetting our embodiment matters on the left end of the ditch, or on the right end of the ditch becoming overly false holiness, if you want to call it that also becomes an idol that damns us as well. And so Jesus confronts that. We talked about the tradition, and we use this Yaroslav Pelikan quote: Christianity calcifies when tradition, the living faith of the dead, becomes traditionalism, the dead faith of the living. And there's a right way to use tradition that shapes our habits and desires and our ultimate loves. Things that we inhabit, we do over, we repeat, shape us. We're surrounded by secular liturgies all the time. We don't call them that, but that's what they're doing. They're creating within us consumption or self-focus or turning sex into a god, that kind of thing in terms of ultimate ends and how we structure our life and our identity. And so, again, that's shifted, and Jesus confronts this within ancient Israel. And then, of course, for us today, we ask the same questions about these 5 T's. Guardrails can be okay, but when they're built across the road, you're missing the point of the road, right? Guardrails can be okay, but if you're driving where your car is scraping alongside of it, you're missing the point. The point is to travel on the road, not to fall into the ditches. And so their oral Torah, the fence around the Torah, these things became, in some ways, and Jesus confronts in Mark, and I think Sunday I said this verse, but I gave the wrong reference, Mark 7:9, again and again, he said this, that their pre-understanding, their all the fencing around Torah work they're doing is actually helping people obey those rules, but never actually fulfilling the law, which is to demonstrate the life of God. So what did we miss on Sunday? We did not get fully into the 3rd T of tribalization, or what I'd like to say also Balkanization. I come from a state where we had lots of reserve lands and had friends who are First Nation, Native American all my life, and so and meaningful relationships with folks and professors and Native American studies in South Dakota. And so I'm disturbed a little bit. This is my asterisk here saying I don't like the word tribalization when it's only used in a negative context, which it is. So we can also borrow from like recent European history, Balkanization, the same idea of ethnic and religious social identities used to demonize, devalue, and in-group, out-group others as well. Okay, but I get that 5 T's works, and there's the alliteration and all that, but there we go. The mission of Israel. So what we didn't get to fully is that Israel had turned very inward, and this is an oversimplification, but Israel was designed or called to be God's vehicle to the nations. God initially, in the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning of the 5 books of the law, the beginning of Genesis, Adam and Eve are pre-Israel. They represent all humanity going forward in time, and Then God gets specific in Abraham in order to make Abraham a blessing to the nations and to mediate God's grace and to become sort of this priesthood of nations, a first among equals. Again and again, though, the tribes turn inward and inward and inward, and sometimes that's a reaction to negative things that happen, but it's also our own broken sinfulness. And the prophets, by the time you get to the end of the Old Testament, the prophets are reminding Israel, like Hosea says, Israel is God's firstborn, not only born, first among equals. There are others. The prophets call Israel to share the light they have with the nations, that was the initial intent of God getting particular, so love can be experienced particularly by being particular people, meeting with other particular people, and expressing this oneness of God and love for all. And so Jesus comes to bring this mission to its completion, and Jesus is really all of Israel embodied, and God embodied, and humanity embodied in one. And then, again, particular, so we experience love particularly. The prophets in the Old Testament, if you want to look up some of these, Isaiah 2 through 4, Isaiah 42, 6, 49, 6, Micah 4, verses 1 through 7, Zechariah 8, 20 through 23, Paul alluding to it in Romans 3, 2. Jesus, again, tells Israel in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 about this idea of the light, that they were keeping their light to themselves, but the light is not supposed to be hidden. It's supposed to be put out there so others can experience the light and also experience that a spreading of that light as well. You can see this tribalism. It's interesting when you hear politicians like in the States use that the U.S. is a city on a hill, quoting also from Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5, missing the very point that light was meant to be spread, not to be seen as sort of this exclusivity, as it were. And so Matthew 5, Jesus reminds them, and then his whole life is about this expanding the mission of Israel, both getting Israel sort of right with God through his work, both his teachings, his sacrificial death and resurrection, his victory over the powers of evil and sin and so forth. But first to help Israel, Matthew 10 and 15, we see that. But then he teaches that his message was to extend to all nations. I like it in John 10:16. I have other sheep who are not in the sheepfold of Israel in this context, and I must bring them in also, and they will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. The expansion. N.T. Wright uses the language, I love this, that in Jesus and the church, Israel is not replaced. There's a lot of problems with replacement theology becoming anti-Semitic in the church history, but it is Israel expanded. Expanded. What a wonderful image of that is what Jesus is doing. He's expanding, setting right the mission of God by himself being God, coming down and taking on all the brokenness forward and backward and expanding the mission. The other big passage in terms of understanding the issue of tribalization or Balkanization, our ethnocentricity and how it can become sinful and destructive. I mean, obviously we talk about white supremacy, we talk about nationalism, but that is not just a white European construct that happens, in the last 200, 300 years of bringing together tribes to create a larger tribal ethnicity thing. But it happens across cultures. We have it today happening with the chairman of Communist China, Chairman Xi, saying, calling on Han blood loyalty to the motherland wherever you are. If you're Han, you owe it to this. And he's not saying to the motherland really, he's saying to him and the Communist Party. And it's a controlling, manipulative, ethnic, racist identity thing, and also forcing it on other ethnic minorities in mainland China. So it's still going on today. The Uyghurs within concentration camps, things that are genocidal behaviors of rape and torture and forced sterilization and all of this. This is the extremes of tribalism or ethnocentricity that Jesus, of course, confronts as fully sinful. But on a milder scale of that, when we engage in that, we're missing something crucial that God is doing. The parable of the Good Samaritan demonstrates this in Luke 10. Ethnocentricity, the Jewish religious leader, who's my neighbor, Jesus tells the story of three people walking down going to Jerusalem. The side of the road, someone is beaten and bloodied. The priest, who is the height of the religious leadership, passes by on the other side, does not engage. The Levite, from whom the group of people, the priests, were chosen, so the next rung passes by. And then the third person comes along. In a normal story pattern would be a Jewish layman, but instead, Jesus replaces that stock character with the Samaritan. The Samaritans were considered half-breeds, false worshippers, twisted Judaism, lots of violence between the main Jewish population and Samaritans, and the story of Shechem and rape and terrorism in the Old Testament between those people and the other Jewish people that did not intermarry with the Gentiles. And so Jesus, just a massive flip on this parable. And so he brings him in and says, ultimately, the person who shows mercy is demonstrating what it means to love your neighbor. And he asks the religious leader, who is the one who showed mercy? The Good Samaritan, of course, helps the person on the road, bandages wounds, risks his own life, putting the beat-up Jewish man naked into a Jewish village as a Samaritan. Probably could have been accused of doing the damage to the guy. Risks his life, doesn't leave him on the outside of the village, takes him into the village, puts him into the inn, pays for his keep, promises to come back and pay for more if necessary. Just completely subverts the story of who should have been the stock rescuer of the guy on the road. And so Jesus asks the religious leader, who was this? Who is the neighbor? And the Jewish leader couldn't even say the Samaritan, said the one who showed him mercy. Boom. And so this idea of tribalization, God confronts us again and again that we love God by, Jesus confronts us as God by saying we love God by loving people and by tearing down walls. Loving people and tearing down walls. Romans 13:8, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. 1 Peter 4:8, above all, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. So we love God by loving other people. This is how we first love God. Not abstractly, but we love other people, and that our worship gatherings, that empowerment should be there for us to love other people outrageously as we encounter the love of God for us. We are empowered to love others, and we love God well by doing that. And also removing religious and ethnic barriers and obstacles. Love is always taking precedence over religious, ritual, and ethnic boundaries, always. And this is why Christianity is so subversive, particularly to cultures and nationalists who want to build around ethno or national identities, because we are saying that ultimately there's a greater family that's not simply bounded by blood, but that spirit is thicker than blood. Ooh, that ought to mess with all of those idolatries, right? That spirit is thicker than blood. Jesus, in response to his relatives in Mark 3, disciples are asking, well, who? Your mother is asking for, your brothers are looking for you. And he says this sort of snarky, salty comment. He says that in Mark 3, he said, who are my mother and brothers but those who do the will of the gods, of God. And so spirit is thicker than blood. And this is something about the Jesus movement. Ethnicity, social status, quoting from Bruxy, and gender identity are no longer meaningful categories of distinction. Instead, all members of this kingdom are unified as one family with God as our shared father and Abraham as our shared ancestor. In fact, the New Testament, they begin to call each other brother and sister. Wow, brother and sister. Not auntie or uncle, brother and sister. Spirit is thicker than blood. This is the work of the new humanity in Jesus, that the church is to be that kind of family, to be a many-cultured, many-vocal family centered on Jesus and his ultimate claim on all of us. So these are the things about tribalism, and there's more we could say, but this passage of bringing in the Samaritan, Jesus teaches that he is tearing down this wall to get Israel back on its mission, to being a light for the nations, and being the first among equals to call all to follow the one true God who is now fully revealed in Jesus. And Jesus makes these claims that ultimately get him killed, because while he doesn't declare, I am God, all the things he's doing are the things that only God can do in terms of rewriting and overthrowing parts of the law and saying ultimately all of it's pointing to me, self-referring or self-referential to himself in Luke 24 and other places we see in the New Testament. And so Israel is expanded. And we have to ask the questions today about our own traditions, lowercase t traditions that may have been good to form people in the past but aren't doing it any longer. And we need to ask questions as well about this idea of tribalism or Balkanization. Have we bought into nationalism and ethnocentricity and it's become an idol in our lives? And do we look down on others or judge others through that lens instead of through the love of God in Jesus? And is our church, as we grow, mutually submitting to one another in love? We can celebrate. The interesting thing is, by the time we get to Revelation, God doesn't do away with the uniqueness of our ethnic, cultural heritages, as it were. They are there, many tribes, many nations before the throne, but the unification of worship and family, the deeper family, is not those genetic ethno lines. Rather, it's the love and the bond of the Spirit and the center of the throne, which is God and the Lamb, Jesus himself. So these are things we have to wrestle with in church life too. Are we pushing through those barriers? Are we exalting too many things of our own preferred or family of culture versus willing to surrender that and celebrate the good, but also celebrate the good in others and making space for one another in love? So there's lots of implications. I could say a whole lot more about it, but I'm over 10 minutes already. So, all right, we'll see you next week and maybe in home church this week as well. God bless.